It's 2023, and with it comes hope, excitement, and the promise of innovation. Unfortunately, it also comes with painful memories of past tragic events. It's been 20 years since the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, one of NASA's worst ever. The timing and extent of the catastrophe make it hard to forget, and in our video today, we shed more light on the details of the mission, the nature of the disaster, and what followed. Could it have been avoided? Why was there no rescue mission? Sit tight, because as we'll soon see, re-entry does not always go according to plan. NASA's Space Shuttle program lasted from 1981 to 2011, and in those 30 years, NASA suffered two major disasters, Challenger and Columbia. In both, all 7 astronauts aboard lost their lives in events that forced NASA to cease human flight missions for more than 2 years, and eventually led to the end of the Space Shuttle program. The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster occurred 20 years ago on February 1st, 2003. This was after NASA had promised to do better following the Challenger explosion in 1986, and at a time when the 9/11 incident was still fresh in our hearts and our minds, leading to all manner of theories as to what caused this tragic event. So, what did actually happen? Let's begin with a brief history of the Space Shuttle program and its purpose for space exploration. The Space Shuttle was a reusable spacecraft employed by NASA to transport astronauts into orbit to conduct experiments and launch and repair satellites in space. Later, it was used to transport modules to build the International Space Station and transported astronauts to and from the ISS. A total of 6 space shuttles were built, but only 5 made it to space. They were Enterprise, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Enterprise being reserved for test flights only, rather than actual space flights. The Columbia was the first shuttle to make it to space. Its debut launch was on April 12, 1981, and it completed 27 missions, until its fatal accident. On January 16, 2003, Columbia made its final launch, marking the beginning of its 28th trip to space. At that time, the Space Shuttle program was heavily focused on constructing the International Space Station. However, STS-107, Columbia's last mission, was a 2-week trip prioritizing space research instead. The 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia were selected around July of 2000 and were scheduled to launch on January 11, 2003. The crew comprised of Mission Commander Rick Husband, a colonel in the U.S. Air Force who had also flown on STS-96, William McCool, a U.S. Navy commander assigned as mission pilot, and Michael Anderson, the mission's payload commander. Kalpana Chawla served as the flight engineer, while Davis Brown and Laurel Clark, both captains in the Navy, were the mission specialists. Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force and the first Israeli astronaut, was the payload specialist. The Columbia was as sturdy as a space shuttle could be. It had been used on 28 missions over 22 years and had orbited the Earth more than 4,000 times, clocking a little more than 300 days of total space-time. In fact, following the explosion of the Challenger, the Columbia was the primary space shuttle used for research purposes and was even used to launch the famous Chandra Observatory in 1999. Columbia was in good form, passing all necessary certifications and tests. Or so we thought. Almost like a warning of things to come, mission STS-107 was delayed 13 times. But against all odds, the Columbia was launched for its final time on January 16, 2003, from the Kennedy Space Center Launch Complex. Following what seemed like a successful takeoff, the grounds team, during a review of the STS-107 launch, observed that a piece of foam had fallen from the left bipod ramp. This is the part of the structure that attaches the external tank to the shuttle. As absurd as it sounds that a piece of foam could be cause for concern, it was in fact a complication that would seal the team's fate. A requirement of the external tank during the space shuttle's design phase was that it would not spew any debris that might endanger the orbiter and its thermal protection system, its TPS. The crew's safety during re-entry depended on the integrity of the TPS components, and the tiles and panels that made up the TPS were only intended to sustain relatively light hits. These foam strikes, though, were not actually so uncommon. Going back to STS-1, the Space Shuttle Columbia's maiden voyage, a foam impact during launch caused damage to the orbiter. Foam strikes were common during space shuttle launches. Of the 79 flights for which launch imagery was available, 65 of them had foam impacts. It was so common that the occurrence was later referred to as foam shedding and was considered a normal flight anomaly. That is, until the Columbia disaster. A video that was later released showed that the piece of foam struck the left wing of the Columbia. It was later discovered that atmospheric gases entered the shuttle through a breach in the left wing, causing the malfunction and loss of the shuttle's sensors, the complete destruction of the Columbia itself upon re-entry, and the death of all 7 astronauts on board. Columbia was making its final approach back to the Kennedy Space Center on February 1, 2003, when Mission Control noticed some unusual data. The temperature measurements from the left wing's sensors were lost, then tire pressure data from the shuttle's left side also disappeared. To discuss the tire pressure measurements, the spacecraft communicator called Columbia. At 8:59 a.m., Rick Husband responded with the words, "Roger," followed by an indiscernible phrase. At that point, Columbia was close to Dallas, moving at 18 times the speed of sound while remaining 200,700 feet above the Earth. Mission Control made many unsuccessful attempts to contact the astronauts. Shortly after, when Columbia should have been making its final approach to the runway, a mission controller got a call. The caller said a television network was airing a video of the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrating in mid-air. To say that this was a terrible day at the office is a gross understatement. The debris from the Columbia explosion spread from central Texas all the way to West Louisiana. It took a team of 25,000 professionals and volunteers to recover 84,000 pieces of the Columbia in a search that covered more than 2 million acres of land. And still, as of 2017, only 40% of the Columbia had been recovered, with pieces still being found even as you watch this video. From here on out, things only got worse. Firstly, it was discovered that Mission Control knew about the imminent doom the Columbia and its crew faced, but said nothing. When they found out about the breach, it was presumably too late. It was either the team wait in space until they ran out of oxygen, or die from an explosion upon re-entry to Earth. Several NASA employees, like Don McCormick Jr., worked hard to get images of the breached wing in space. According to reports, the Department of Defense was ready to employ its orbiting reconnaissance satellites to obtain a better look. Still, several NASA officials, primarily Linda Ham, the head of the mission management team for all space shuttle flights, declined the offer. It was also argued that the Atlantis space shuttle could have been potentially used to stage a high-risk rescue mission, but we will never know if it would have been successful. David Baker, a space scientist that worked with NASA on the Space Shuttle program, said that he, quote, examined blueprints that imply that a spectacular and bold orbital rescue mission might have been undertaken, if only Mission Control had learned about the risk in time, end quote. Baker claims that when Columbia blasted off on January 16th, the Atlantis space shuttle was almost ready for a flight on March 1st. A rescue mission would have required identifying the issue by day 2 and accelerating the Atlantis preparation timetable from 6 weeks to 4 weeks, because Columbia only had enough supplies to keep the crew alive for 30 days. If it had been possible to do that, Atlantis may have been placed in an orbit that would have brought it within 6 degrees of Columbia at a 90-degree angle, requiring expert flying to keep the tails from colliding. With a smaller crew of 4 astronauts, 2 of them would have piloted the Atlantis, while the other 2 would have begun the rescue by sending lithium hydroxide canisters to the Columbia to lower the Columbia's dangerously high carbon dioxide levels. The crew of the Columbia would have then been guided to safety by an extended pole that the Atlantis astronauts would have placed between the two spacecraft. So why didn't NASA ever try such a rescue mission? According to Baker, the fundamental error was not having a sufficiently thorough investigation quickly enough. Until the evidence kept piling up daily, it didn't seem like the harm would have been that awful. Another problem, according to Baker, was that NASA did not adopt the failure is not an option mentality that had allowed the Apollo 13 crew to escape death in 1970 when their spacecraft suffered damage en route to the moon. In the end, the decision makers made a call that cost 7 lives, ended a number of careers, and would ultimately lead to the retirement of the Space Shuttle program. Following the incident, the official Columbia Accident Investigation Board report discussed and criticized the actions and decisions of Ham and several other senior NASA managers involved in mission STS-107. Ham was demoted and removed from her managerial position in the Space Shuttle program. The investigation board advised NASA to relentlessly search out and eradicate safety issues like the foam shedding in order to guarantee astronaut safety on subsequent flights. Of course, this also required more stable funding and political backing for the organization. You see, since the 90s, NASA had been facing serious budget cuts, which had been worsening with each passing year. By the time of the Bush administration, NASA was on a shoestring budget, still having to produce results while also prioritizing the construction and completion of the ISS. New safety precautions were put in place, including scanning the shuttle's belly for cracked tiles and additional camera images during takeoff in order to better track foam shedding. The Space Shuttle fleet persevered for as long as it could in order to complete the construction of the International Space Station. There was even a popular idea that the ISS could be used as a safe haven for astronauts in case of another launch-related foam issue. Upon the completion of the ISS, after 135 flights, including the tragic events of Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, which resulted in the deaths of a total of 14 astronauts, the Space Shuttle program was officially shut down in July of 2011. To continue its missions to and from the ISS, NASA negotiated a deal with Russia to utilize Soyuz spacecraft to transport American astronauts. And then, 2020 saw a monumental shift to the first commercially contracted flights. 20 years after the Columbia disaster, NASA now employs rockets from SpaceX and several other private companies as they look to make space exploration cheaper, faster, and safer. We are eternally indebted to the astronauts of the final voyage of the Columbia for their courage and contribution to science, space, humanity, and generations of astronauts. Do you think NASA should continue to rely on private space exploration companies? Let us know what you think in the comments.